I'm Nancy Briggs. I am the manager and senior statistical consultant at Stat Central. Welcome to our October monthly seminar. Before we get started, bring up my thing. I would like to show my respects and acknowledge the Bedegal people who are the traditional custodians of the land of elders past and present on which this meeting takes place. Today, I'm really happy to introduce to you Daniel Falster. He is associate professor in the School of Biological, Earth and Environmental Sciences. So he studies how forests grow and how traits of the species of plants in those forests are related to the environment in which they exist. He graduated from UNSW as an undergrad, but he did his graduate work and postgrad work at Macquarie, and then he spent some time overseas working in Norway and Austria, and then came back to UNSW a few years ago. So we're very happy to have him back, and he's going to share with us one of the things that he finds really important as a researcher, and helping researchers with their statistics and coding skills. And this talk is going to be focusing on reproducibility. So I'm so happy that he is here to speak with us. Daniel, go ahead.
Thanks so much, Nancy. Can you hear me okay, and can you see my slides all right? Yep. Excellent. Thanks very much for that intro, and thanks to you and all the Stat Central team, both for putting on this series and all the hard work that you do. I think it's really important. And I'm very happy for the opportunity to talk about this topic. It's one of my sort of secret hobbies, if you like, which you do and I'm passionate about, and it's nice to have an opportunity to share that. And I'd also just like to start by thanking some of my reproducibility heroes, people who have inspired me through the years and changed the way I code and do science. And so that's Rich Fitzjohn, Greg Wilson, Sarah Swindecker, Anna Cristalli, Will Cornwall, and the whole ROpenSci team. Okay, so here's one view of what the scientific process looks like. We start with some sort of problem or theory that we want to test, or a problem we want to solve. We come up with a more specific question of how to advance knowledge. We design our study, we collect data, we do the data analysis, we do the inference, we learn about answers to our problem, and then the cycle goes round again. And it's important to start out by saying I'm talking about reproducibility and transparency, but science has had these ideas at their core for a very long time. It's meant to be transparent, it's meant to be reproducible. This was embodied when journals came about as a way of sharing knowledge. And since then, the idea has been that based on a journal article, I should be able to understand what you did. It should be clear the methods that you used. It should be clear how you came to your conclusions, how you collected your data. And in principle, I should be able to reproduce your results if I followed all the details in the paper. So I think all of us as scientists have this sort of embedded in our core being of transparency and reproducibility is at the center of what we do. And yet we're supposedly in the midst of a reproducibility crisis. There's been a number of articles in high profile outlets discussing how various elements of research aren't reproducible. Then there's been gatherings of people to sort of look into why this is the case. Here's a couple from Nature, from The Conversation. And of course, there's a whole lot of people trying to improve the processes of science so that science is more reproducible. And today, I'm not going to talk that reproducibility covers all dimensions of the scientific process. So, you know, the whole circle here. I'm going to be focusing on what I and others might call computational reproducibility. So we're not going to be looking at what you could do to improve the design of your studies and the setup and collection of data. Rather, let's just assume you have data and you're producing a variety of outputs from that data. So you'll have plots, you'll have some statistics, you'll have some coefficients for a model perhaps. You'll be putting those into your paper. And computational reproducibility is really, if I asked you to go to just, open up the analysis and show me where you got that plot, that statistic, that table from. Could you reproduce it? That's the core of what we're after. And if I looked at your code, would it be clear to me how you came to that answer? And so I think for anyone who's, especially if you're in the more quantitative area, but just generally, I'd say for most people, even though journals have this aspiration to be transparent and enable you to reproduce studies, when it comes to the data analysis and the statistics, the methods section of the paper really isn't enough. We can understand in the written form what someone was trying to do, but there's such a gap between the way you write the methods section and the way you write the code, was that there's a big black hole there in between. And so now it'll be common for people to post the data to go along with their study, ideally to post the code to go along with their study, and you can download the code and look at how it works. And if, like in this paper, they're putting forward a new method that hasn't been used before, maybe there'll even be a blog post explaining a bit more with worked examples of how that method works. And so with those sorts of extras, we can really up the reproducibility stakes in our research. So based on that, my ideal outcome for scientific papers is that you have all your analyses and data probably in a Git repository. I'll explain more what that is in a minute. You have some code which can generate all your outputs from the raw data. So the statistics, the figures, the tables. You have some helpful information which would guide you and others as to what's in your repository. So, where did you get the data from? What study is it going with? What sort of license goes with the code and the data? What do you need to run this code? And that all of this would be archived. I mentioned a Git repository. We share a lot of things on GitHub, or you could use Bitbucket or GitLabs. But all of this would be archived in some sort of long-term scientific repository as well. I put a lot of things in Zenodo, or there could be Figshare or other repositories suitable for your area. And then you'll put the links to that material in your paper, so it becomes part of the methods. So this isn't just talk. I've been trying to do this for 10 years with varying degrees of commitment, and probably around 10 papers now where we've made the code available along with the analysis, and we aspire to do that for all of the work coming out of our research, out of our lab. Here's a couple of examples. You could just see here this data accessibility code, and data was deposited in Zenodo with a link. You can go and download the code and the data and potentially rerun our analyses and not only reproduce our results, but see how they were done. And here's another one from a paper by Anis Guibert. Okay, now, probably a lot of you are going, yikes. I can't imagine sharing my code and data and making everything 100% reproducible. And what I want to do now is say, look, you don't need to go that far. There's actually a lot of reason to adopt the principles of reproducibility, and there's a lot of levels in between which you can kind of step up. And so here's a few things that you could aspire for. One, that you could reproduce some result on the same day, even after restarting R. That can be a bit of a barrier because there's a lot of things that go on when you restart, you reload everything. In fact, if you get this far, you're probably 80% of the way to getting code online. Maybe, how about trying to come back to it a month or a few months later and reproduce the result again? By then, you've forgotten a lot of the things that were fresh in your mind, and that'll really test your ability to navigate the materials. What happens if you have to switch to a new computer? Then you're introducing a new set of tests about how much was your code specific to just running on that computer in that particular way and the way it was set up. Can your collaborators reproduce your results? If they can, you're almost there. And the final one is a random reader of your paper can reproduce your results. In fact, I think most of the benefits in reproducibility are sort of up to about level 4. Once you're there, whether a random reader or can reproduce your results or not, you know, it'd be nice if they could. There's a bunch of barriers to doing that, but really you've just, by going through this process, you've already gathered a lot of the benefits of making your research more reproducible. And so as an example, I think you can type this in later. Here's a simple one from mine. I just wanted to emphasize, it doesn't have to be a complicated study. In this paper, there's essentially 3 core plots. Here they are, with, you know, just a line fitted. And the code that's available there still reproduces these core results 14 years later. I put the code up. While I had the code at the time, I didn't realize sort of posting code was a thing at the time, but I put it up later. But, you know, no matter how simple or complex your study is, it's something to aspire to. And in fact, simple is better. Okay, now let's just focus a little bit now on why you would want to do this. And I've so far talked about the broader benefit to science. You know, we should do this because science is meant to be transparent and reproducible. But the inherent motivation there is that, you know, we might be making mistakes. And by putting it out there, you know, we're opening ourselves up to critique and transparency and stuff. There's a secondary benefit that people can look at your code and learn from what you did. But I think at least this sort of what I would see, avoiding a negative outcome, avoiding a problematic result or a false result, is the reason the crisis is raised, but actually it's a bit of a barrier to people doing reproducible research, because who wants to put their stuff out to be, you know, interrogated and potentially found that it wasn't working? And so I think for a lot of people, I mean, you should just do it anyway. The chance of of that happening seems very low, and if it does, then good, you can self-correct. But that is just one part of, I think, why reproducibility is important. And it, as I say, it starts from this sort of negative, avoiding some negative. My reasons for doing it are the following 3 reasons, and it's the same thing that you know makes science better, that achieves all of these 3. Number 1, I have a library of great clean examples of how to analyze particular problems in my research. When I solve a problem in a study and the code is there and I can reproduce my results, I'm able to quickly go back to that study, grab that bit of code and reuse it in a new project or see how I solved something. And so I'm building, as I go, I'm building my own library of examples which are perfect for the sort of research that I do. And I'm not having to resolve problems all along the way. The second is it keeps me sane, and it actually makes me have more fun doing my projects. So why does it keep me sane? I spend less time having to navigate through my files and my projects and being able to pick up where I left off. I mean, I don't know about you, but I have multiple projects on the go, and each time you switch between projects, there's a bit of a cost. The things which make your work reproducible and transparent enable you to work easier on more projects and to switch between them and to come back to them when you get, you know, reviewers' comments and so forth, and pick up where you left off with a lot less effort and brain power. And so this is where the sanity comes in. I spend less time trying to figure out where I was up to and more time doing the science, the coding, and that's a good thing. And the last one is that the same things which make your research more reproducible, good for science, also help you to collaborate better with some other colleagues. Because in essence, collaborating with other colleagues on code and analyses is essentially demanding that you make, sorry, I'm just messing around with my windows here, is essentially demanding that you make the work reproducible on their computer. And so these are the 3 motivations which keep me going day to day And this last one, good for science, kind of comes along for the ride as an additional thing that I feel can motivate me, but not the main thing. Okay. So here's my top 6 strategies for making research more reproducible. Now, before I go through them, and I'm going to go through them in an R session in a second, I'll just say they're not super complicated. In fact, they're sort of like, simple rules for a contented life using R. And it wasn't obvious to me when I started using R that I should do things this way. But once I did, the barriers to working in R, the barriers to coding, the barriers to switching projects and so forth, just sort of fell away, and it's really just made my life so much better. And so the 6 strategies are: 1, make every project self-contained. 2, use intuitive structure for each project. 3, avoid manual steps in the chain from data to results wherever you can. 4, rerun your code often from scratch. In fact, every time I come back to the project. 5, use version control. And 6, collaborate on code. So I'm going to step through these, and I'm going to try and do this with a bit of a live code stuff on screen. So we'll switch away from the slides and go to, let's see, we don't want email. Okay, that's 1. Okay, we're just gathering a few examples here. And let's open up RStudio in a new session. I'll just close everything. And I wanted to start here with an example of how you probably shouldn't do it. So to highlight some of the issues we're trying to avoid, and then we'll look at how we could do it better. Okay, so I've opened up an RStudio session here. And as I said, this is an example of how not to do it. And I'll highlight a few things here that make reproducibility hard. Okay, just give me a second. All right, I've lost my notes on that, but that's all right. I'll try and remember them. Okay, so I've opened it up, and here's the first one. I'm reading in a file, and I've got a full path name here on my computer. Now, remember I talked about making projects self-contained. This has already broken that, because this code is only going to work on this computer when that file is in exactly the same spot on my computer when I wrote this code, which was whenever it was. And I've got a second example here. Oh, that one does actually work. But you can easily imagine that you've moved some things around and this code no longer works. So wherever possible, you want to avoid these big, long path names and instead go for something short, which is in your project like that, where you bring all the things into one spot. Now, there's a trap here because R encourages you to work this way by using this set working directory. You can choose a directory and so forth, and then it tells you to use these big, long path names. I would suggest avoiding it if you can. The second thing is I've drawn in, because I wrote some code which I thought was generally useful for a lot of my analyses, I've put it in a generic file called utils, which I've got on my desktop, and I can bring that in and make that available. It makes some functions here that I've written available. Whoops. Okay, there we go. It's no longer can be found. There's a reproducibility problem immediately. But also that as I go, those functions, I may need to update them. And because I'm sharing them across lots of different projects, when I update it for one project, I might break it for another project, try as I might to avoid that. So generally, I used to do this. I would suggest not having some master file which has all your useful functions in it, but instead copying bits into each project. Okay, problem number 3. There's some object here, data, which exists. Oh, the code doesn't run because we don't have all the dependencies in it. So we need to go up here and tell it we're using dplyr, for example. Maybe that'll run now, yeah. But in addition, where did this data thing come from? It's not here in the code. I've got it up here in the environment. It was loaded when I opened R, but like, wow, it's got a name data, which I can only imagine contains some data, but otherwise is a bit mysterious where it came from. My reproducibility has fallen in a heap by this point. I've also got a couple of linear model fits, which again, I'm not really sure. And you may have noticed that when you close R, it will ask you, let's see if it does it now, if I want to save the workspace to a file.rdata. That's where this stuff comes from when you open RStudio, and here it is here. It's a really bad idea for reproducibility, in my opinion, because basically what we're doing is we're loading up each time things that we created in the past that we don't remember how we created, and using them as though we believe that they're reasonable. And so what I do is go in here into preferences, unclick this restore R data, tell it to never save that thing, then delete it and never use it again. And I'll come back to what I do instead. Okay, so here's some problems with, one more problem to point out is I've got various bits of code, and I see this often, is I've got a bit of code here where it's essentially been copied a second time and maybe modified slightly. I'm not quite sure what's different about this version. So this is kind of like you're keeping multiple versions of the code. And we've got some commented out bits. Are they commented out because I didn't want to run them this time, or are they commented out because I no longer need them? I can't remember. So there's some of the pitfalls that you can fall into just with everyday usage of R. Sorry, here's the other one, is when we look in the file for this folder for this project, we can see we've got like a whole lot of R scripts, a whole lot of RMD scripts. Some of my RMDs have been copied. So I've got number 1, 2, and 3, which I guess is different versions which have been modified and so forth. Another one here. I'm actually not quite sure where to start. I've got some results, but I'm not sure where they were created. Yeah, I'm a bit lost. I'm a bit overwhelmed. I've come back to this project after a while. I don't really remember where my latest work was. And now I'm in a bit of a bind as to how I created some of these plots and where am I going to get them from. Okay, so there's my sort of like common pitfalls. Let's try and avoid that. Let's switch now to a better example. Oh, sorry. There is one more pitfall, which is that when people often open R and RStudio, they'll go and they'll double click on an R project or an RMD file, and it will pop up here in RStudio. But the problem is it opens in an existing RStudio window, and so we can end up with mismatches between our code and our working directories and where everything is. So we have to go setting our working directory, moving things around. We've got things in our environment from multiple different analyses. This is also something you really want to avoid if you can. Okay, so the better way forward. Recall I said the first step is have each project in a separate folder. So here I am, I've got 4 examples. This is the one I just showed you. then I've got 3 better ones. And these are entirely self-contained analyses. And they have everything I need for that study. Here's the one I mentioned in the slides. And they also have this file in here, the RStudio project file. So instead of opening the .r file, I'm going to open the RStudio project file, see what happens. Okay, I've opened up in a clean environment. RStudio has moved to the right folder, the right place, without me needing to set working directories or anything like that. And I've got everything I need for this project in this folder. And the second point that I made was about using a clear, intuitive structure. This is a common sort of layout that I'll have for my projects, where I'll often have a file called analysis.r or main.r. And if I load that, it's my main guide to the whole analysis. It's the sort of architect of running the whole thing. As I said, this one's really simple. It's got a few figures that it produces, and it's just got one dependency, package here called smatter. And so immediately when I go to this, I can see where I need to look. The data that I need to use is stored always in a folder called data. Anything in a folder called R is functions that I've written, which I'm going to use in my analysis. And then I'll often create a folder called output, and all my plots and everything created from the code goes into that. Let's see if this runs. We'll be lucky if it does. Ah, yay. Okay, so here we are. I've now created the main results from the figure, from the paper, from the relatively straightforward analysis. Now I've got some others that I can show you. Here's another one, Dersma 2016. This was a collaborative one where we worked on this together. You can see it's got overall the same structure. Now, let me just take a pause. If Nancy invites me over for dinner and I'm at her house and she says, Daniel, would you get the forks out? I'll probably have a pretty good guess where the forks are. I go into the kitchen, I go to the top drawer in the kitchen, the little one, and pull it out. I bet the knives, forks, and spoons will be right there. That's the sort of mindset I take to having this directory structure. Is I don't have to think about it. You adopt a structure which you then apply to every project. The structure I've got here is quite common across the community, and it means that I don't need to think about how to find particular things because they're always in predictable places. You can see this one also has a folder called MS for manuscript, which in this case we wrote it in LaTeX. Sometimes that folder is in this same directory. Other times it's in another directory. But in any case, you can see, and the other thing you can see is that I've only got the latest working code here. I don't have all my old code, which, believe me, we wrote lots more code for this analysis, but I've only kept the clean working code at the end because that way I can, when I come back to it, I know what's relevant. I haven't kept old out-of-date code, which ultimately will confuse me. And so this one's a bit more complex. We've got many more packages that are being needed. We've got a few different files with functions, but then the workflow is all just stepped out really clearly here, where these create all the tables and statistics in the paper, and then creating a bunch of figures as well. And then in the end, we actually had a supplement for this paper where we had a knitted document. So this is like an RMD file, but we've written in LaTeX. You can do the same with RMD, and we generate that as well here, where it produces the supplement for the paper as well. So that's really good. I forgot how all this code works, but I can come back to it and go, that's where that bit was done. I'll go and look at that function and see in more detail how it works. Okay, now I mentioned those RStudio project files. See now up here, I've got this RStudio project option where I can now jump between different projects, and RStudio will flip over to the other project. I'll jump around a little bit. And also, if you use these project files, you can actually have multiple sessions open at the same time for different projects. And so you can jump between projects, but you can also have multiple sessions open. And in each case, the environment and the files and the directories and stuff are entirely relevant for that code. Now, notice here also that when I call files and so forth, there's no absolute path names. So there's none of, this would be the absolute path name, et cetera, et cetera. It's because when you use the projects, RStudio anchors you in a folder and you only have to go relative to where you are now. So in this case, this is my root folder. When I say look in R, it looks directly in the folder in R because the working directory is already set in the right place. Now, that's pretty fundamental because that means actually I can close this folder and I can take that folder here and I can move it to another folder. So I'll move it into here. Let's say I could be copying to another computer or something. And then I can open it up, pick up my work again, open the RStudio project. And everything should work. I don't need to change any working directories or anything like that because we've used the RStudio project function to anchor our project in a particular folder. Doesn't matter where that folder is. And then everything's called relative to there and it's completely self-contained. Okay, so let me see where I'm up to. This is, so we've talked about making the project self-contained. We've also talked about number 2, which is stay organized and using a predictable, intuitive structure for your projects so that when you come back to them, you sort of can navigate easily around them. You can find the forks really easily and you're not holding on to lots of old files in the work. So that takes me to number 3, which is avoiding manual steps. So I'm going to go back to this project here with a more complicated sort of analysis function. And essentially, you could see here, all the joining and all the data manipulation, this is all of that. And there's quite a bit of work that we needed to do that. And it took us time. Now, I don't know about you, but I find that organizing the data for an analysis is time consuming and is one of the more time-consuming parts of a project. And when I encounter for the first time something that I don't always know how to do in R, it'll take me a little while to figure it out. But then once I've done it, I code it up and I leave it there as code to be rerun. Oh, that's interesting. And the reason I do that is so that I've got an end-to-end chain of reproducibility. So I've got, if I change the data, in this case, I was using a database where we were using a particular version of the data. And let's say I wanted to update which data I was using as a source. I don't want to have to go and redo a whole lot of manual steps along the way. And I really want to be able to rerun my code often. Rerun my code and have all the things produced. And so I would encourage you to embrace the challenge of getting it to work in code, because every time I've done that, 1, I've found a solution. 2, I've learned how to do something that I didn't know to do before. And 3, I've avoided having to go and redo those manual steps, which you inevitably do down the track when new data comes or you need to update something and you've gone and said, oh, I did that in Excel where I copied and pasted and then edited all the cells. So spend the time to figure it out how to do those manipulations along the way. Okay, that enables number 4, which is rerun from scratch. So as a check on my reproducibility, let's say in this project, I was up to this point here where, I was doing some model development. Each time I come back to this project, I'd probably just open it up, run everything from scratch. And, really it might only take, let's see, it's taken all of about 10 seconds. Even though we're doing all this data manipulation and stuff, unless you're working with really big, expensive processes, and you can see here the environment's now populated from the code with all the stuff that we've coded up along the way, unless you're working with really, that these steps take a really long time, I always rerun it just from scratch. I never store what's in here. I never cache it, because this type of process of rerunning from scratch is actually my first check on reproducibility. I'm building it up. Reproducibility isn't something that I add at the end and go, oh, now I should make it reproducible. It's actually something that's been added gradually along the way as I build up the analysis as I go. So that's actually point number 4, which is rerunning from scratch wherever possible. A lot of people might be familiar with the idea that you can clear the workspace. That's another way to rerun. You don't need to restart R. Basically, now I need to rerun everything again if I want to keep going. Okay, then the last one is, second last one, I think. Second last one is using version control. So I mentioned not keeping old code. And one of the reasons I'm happy to do that is I have projects under version control. Now, for those of you who haven't encountered version control before, this is probably something you've heard about. But one of the reasons I love version control, and there's 2 big ones. One is that it enables me to keep my directories clean with the latest code that works. So I'm a happy deleter of code. There's no code hoarding here. Or if you are, the hoarding is in a very controlled way. If we look in any project which has version control with Git, there's this hidden file here, .git, and that's where all the code hoarding happens, because that's where Git keeps different copies of your analysis. Now I'm just going to go ahead and get rid of my changes here. This should update so that all this disappears. There we go. And in Git, I can see old versions of the code. Come on, computer. Well, that's not going so well. I was going to use the point and click version. But here are all the past versions of the code. And in principle, I can just jump back to an old version. And I have the code as it was back when, okay, that didn't quite work either. Something interesting going on here. Maybe because I put it all on my desktop and it's in iCloud and it's not quite synced properly. But in principle, you can jump back and forth between different versions very, very easily. So when I delete old code, I know that it's there in the history and I can pull it out. And that brings me to the last point, which is about collaboration. As soon as you have things under GitHub, under version control, and you have this nice structure, you're perfectly situated to collaborate with your colleagues on your analyses. So I thought I'd just jump over to this paper, Dersma 2018 that I was showing, and point to here is on GitHub where we've been exchanging code. And you can see, for example, here's a change that my colleague made where I can see exactly what they changed. And Git, does a nice job of merging all of these things together. Now, I'm not going to cover how version control works, but you can see here that we've both been happily collaborating on this analysis together. And this reproducible structure, not only does it make it better on our computer, it also makes it better that we can collaborate together and do the same and analyze stuff together. And we use GitHub as the place that we exchange all of that. And all of that history is kept. Okay, so let me go back to slides. Nancy, I'll assume that you can see this again okay. I've got the slides on full screen. If for some reason you can't, please let me know. So there's my top 6 strategies. As I said, they're a little bit sort of like basic life organization when you're doing computing in R, but for me, they're the most important things about reproducibility and transparency. They keep me sane. They mean that I can go back, work between different projects and be able to navigate them easily and figure out what code did what, and ultimately reproduce results quite easily. Now, there are some barriers to reproducing code, and I just want to reproducing results, and I just want to quickly touch on them, because if you walk away from this and go, now that I do these 6 things that Dan told me, I'll never have code not run again, that would be misleading. And here's some of the reasons why. These shouldn't stop you or prevent you from doing these using these strategies. They're just things that I want to alert you to that can make it harder. So the first one is that, and you're probably all familiar with this, that you update R and you update a version of a package, and your code, which used to run, breaks and no longer keeps working. And one strategy I've seen people do is to sort of like freeze themselves in a version of R and packages from several years ago to make sure their stuff always works and you therefore never encounter this problem. I'm of the other approach. I always update stuff, and I like to keep up to date. I sort of see this process of things improving in the R package landscape over time and in R itself a good thing, because they're becoming more usable and better over time. The cost of that is, of course, that they break occasionally when changes have been made. But I personally would much rather have the newer, cleaner version for the rest of my life than be stuck with the older, clunkier version from 5-10 years ago. R wouldn't be what it is today if things weren't allowed to evolve and improve like this. So my strategy to reduce those tensions is just update as soon as possible. And if you'll usually only have 1 or 2 lines in your code which break when these types of update problems happen, and you just need to track them down and find them. And if you're not too far out of date, then you'll find that the number of breakages isn't that big either. Second, the reproducibility, the end-to-end reproducibility can be hard if you have some expensive computing to do. Let's say you're running a model which takes a long time to fit. Of course, you're not going to want to rerun it from scratch every time you open up your project. And that'll be particularly the case if you have to run anything on a high-performance computing environment. What I do then is I'll set up the code to run the expensive stuff, and then I'll save it straight away. I won't do any processing of it. I'll save it straight away using an RDS format. So an RDS is an R data structure where you can essentially, let's say I fitted a linear model. I've got some model called fit. I can just write save RDS fit, and then the file name fitted model.rds. And then I can read that back in again. The reason I do it straight away and I don't sort of go forward to generating figures and things is often that process of generating the figures is the one you're going to want to repeat over and over and over again. And in my end-to-end reproducibility, I can pick up by just reading in those saved expensive results and keep going over the figure generation and table generation. It can also get difficult if the data that you're working with is really, really big or private. In that case, you won't want to go putting your data in your GitHub repository. There's strategies with GitHub to say, don't include a particular file into the repository or the version control. Generally, you want to keep that reserved for just the sort of the code components or simple data like CSV files. What I tend to do is I use that same strategy of the predictable structure, but I will exclude that data from my repository, and I'll have some separate instructions, maybe in the README document in my repository, which says how to access the data, and put it maybe even a separate script in my code, which pulls down the data and assembles it in the right spot. So I sort of isolate that component out. Sometimes you might need some unusual system dependencies. And what I mean by that is you've got R, but it's requiring some software to be installed or your computer to be set up in a particular way. And really, you didn't know that this was required, or you set it up and you forgot about it, which is really common. The way to uncover this, and then when you go to rerun your code at a later date, it doesn't run because that stuff's not there. Two things to do there. One is document the system dependencies so that you can, in fact, it's mostly for yourself. When you get a new computer, you can remember how to set up the dependency that you needed, but also collaborating with colleagues on code is really important, because as soon as they can't run it, it helps uncover those issues that it's somehow specific to your computer. And if they can run the thing, then you've sort of succeeded in getting it to run on multiple computers. The last situation I've encountered, which makes reproducibility hard, is I was collaborating with some people who insisted that they use Python. We insisted that we use R. And of course, that makes the end-to-end reproducibility difficult. I think that's getting easier now with some of the notebooks that RStudio is putting together, where you can have Python and R in the same notebook, but I haven't tried that yet. But at least when I was trying it, it was really difficult, because we tried to wire it all together so that you could sort of call one from the other and things. And we ended up spending more time on software engineering than we did on the science. So my simple strategy there would be, don't wire it all together, and, try and come up with some solutions which keep that idea of end-to-end reproducibility at least in mind as you find out a way to work together. So I think that's where I'll leave it, Nancy, and I'll just leave the main suggested strategies on the screen. Happy to take any comments or feedback.
Thank you so much, Daniel. There's one question in the chat from Tuki, and Tuki says, is containerizing your favorite functions and sourcing them in the analysis.r a personal preference, or do you recommend doing this?
Okay, Tuki, so containerizing your favorite functions and sourcing them in analysis.r a personal preference, or do you I do recommend that. I mean, it's not just my favorite functions. So I will have often a file called utils, which is, let's see if this project has one. Oh, here we go. This is one I might, this was before tidyverse's read CSV. I had a read CSV with strings as factors false. And so I would copy this one often between projects. But I would never, I moved away from having a master version, which all projects used, because when I changed it, I'd sort of break things inadvertently. So my preference is to write stuff that you find useful and copy it to a new project. And if you really need the updated version from another project, you can go copy that. So yeah, I definitely would recommend the strategy of, so here, having functions in files and then sourcing it in. So if you're not familiar with this, this reads in everything in this file. And so in this case, let's go here and we'll look at, say, figures.data. I've got a function load data, and you can see there's a bit of mess involved here. You know, again, this was before tidyverse. I would probably use tidyverse now, but I had to do a bunch of data manipulation. I quite like to package that stuff up into a function, because once I've done it, I don't want to see all this mess. I like to see just the version here where it's sort of got load data and I know what it's doing, but I don't need to go and see that every time.
Oh, we got some more questions in chat. What happens after you delete your R data file, and why do you do this?
When I delete my R data file, it means that when I close R, it no longer saves my environment where I'm up to. And when I open R, it opens with an empty environment like this here. So nothing has been carried over from the previous session. And I rerun everything using my analysis.r script that I've got here and recreate the stuff as I go.
Okay, James asks, what do you think of package version management software like Checkpoint?
That's a great question, James. I'm not actually familiar with Checkpoint. I know there's another one that's come out recently called Rig, and there's another one called R Environment. And they can be quite exciting for having multiple versions of packages installed. And I believe that's what Checkpoint does as well. I kind of played a little bit with that and found I was working a little bit too much in software engineering landscape. And really what I should probably just do is update some of my code to run with the latest versions of packages. So that's the strategy I've taken, because I kind of can't be bothered with the other things. Another one I didn't mention is Docker. Docker creates these containerized versions of, it's essentially a little Linux machine that you can load. And the nice thing about them is when you do your analysis, you can create a Docker container which has the right version of R and the right packages at the time. And then you can potentially pull that up at a later date and sort of be transported back to R 3.2 with the old version of, you know, whichever packages you're working with. Again, it sort of feels like it'd be nice to have, but it takes extra time to do it. And so I tend not to do it. I do the bits that I do because they actually make my life better every day. The bits which in principle might make my code that much more reproducible are the ones that I find slip down the priority list. And that's one of them.
Okay, a few more questions. How do you reproducibly create tables and editable Excel charts, because a client demands Excel outputs and not R?
Great question. Something that's come on so I used to say always draw your data from CSVs and save it to CSVs. There's a really nice package that's out now called the Read Excel package. And you can now read data from Excel spreadsheets as easily as you can from a CSV. And so I found myself starting to now use Excel spreadsheets, but resisting the urge to go and put in lots of custom formulas and things like that. I just use it as a data, sort of, here's my data. There's another one, which is you can write Excel spreadsheets as well. It's really hard though, and I appreciate your challenge there, because some colleagues, you know, that's the way they work. And taking your CSV and putting it into an Excel is really frustrating. There is a Write Excel. It's not in this package. I'd have to look it up. So you could try that out. In terms of making tables, that's always been a bit frustrating. Depends on whether you're writing in Word or LaTeX and other things. There's a variety of packages for doing that. I personally, copying and pasting things into tables and stuff drives me crazy. So I try and use LaTeX. That's one of the main reasons, because I like the tables to be produced by the code, but I appreciate that's not for everyone, in which case, don't polish, set your tables up so that it's easy to copy and paste from a CSV into the table so that you can update it with later versions. Because, you know, for example, you could just save the table as a output as a CSV and then paste it. But you could also, you can actually RMD knitted documents can generate Word outputs as well. So you could also try and use those to generate your tables and integrate that into your workflow.
Karina asks if you have any advice for people that have to run scripts mainly on a server, but not RStudio.
Yeah, you can use the same structure here. In fact, I run scripts. It depends where you're talking about. So I do a lot of work on Katana, which is the UNSW high performance computer environment. One of the nice things having my code on GitHub is that I can actually use that in the terminal from Katana, and I can pull the code down and run things there. None of the stuff that I've shown you here actually requires you to use RStudio. The only one that is RStudio specific is the project file, but you can equally do this in terminal as well. So if you get to a particular place in terminal and let's say open up here and then start R, you're in the same situation where you're in the right spot and you can use all the same code. So yeah, you could also then potentially run your R script via whatever means you do. I don't know. And that can also be tested on your own computer if you've got this same strategy here.
Okay. What advice in terms of structuring the folders of code would you give to people with expensive things to compute? For example, how to manage sequential steps?
I tend to have everything just in one folder R, which has functions in it. So I tend to put everything in a function, even if it's a relatively simple thing. So I think we had one here, which was just load data. So that could also be your expensive code step. So let's say you had a function which was run model, and you passed it in some data, and here's your output. And let's say this takes a long time to run. I tend to just put that in my same workflow, but I will have something like the file is my output / model run.rds, and then I have if not file.exists, file, do that. So run the expensive model, and you might do that on some other computer or something like that and copy this output back. And then here's the save RDS step that I was talking about. Put your, and then I pick up with the output will be read RDS file. So this thing could take a long time. I don't really see that you need to sort of separate it out necessarily because it's going to take a long time. It's more about putting this sort of step in there that you cache the intermediate outputs and then pick them up again. There may be better and more complicated both better and or more complicated ways to do this. I like this simple approach.
Jenny says, hey, this is a great talk. Do you have tips for Git beginners who are just beginning to use it to collaborate, and how to best avoid the dreaded conflict?
This is one of the hardest ones I've found through the years, and that's a great question, Jenny. I think it's, one tip is use GitHub Desktop. So, and particularly for teaching and working with students and stuff. So I love that RStudio has Git in here, but I've found it throws up, and it works, but I've found that two issues. One is that collaborating via GitHub, it often asks for password and there's recognition problems, and it can just be a little bit more hard to set up. And so actually lately I've had students and staff using GitHub Desktop, which kind of syncs your credentials and has things running really smoothly to do all the Git components. You can actually still do commits and stuff in here, but it does the push-pull sort of components. The second is practice. So find excuses to just give it a go, because it's one of those things where, unless you do it regularly, it slips out of your brain. And so I do it all the time, but doing it once every 6 months, you've got no hope, sort of thing, unfortunately. It's second nature for me now, but I appreciate that it's a barrier. I've seen it be a barrier over and over and over again. So yeah, GitHub Desktop's the best solution.
Gordana wants to know what the difference between save RDS and save is.
I actually don't know. I know there is another function, save and load, but save RDS, at least I know, just saves the specific object that you're talking about. So in this case, it'll save whatever is in the object output to the file name here. And so it could be a data frame, it could be a list, it could be a number of other things. It's kind of like a compressed version of whatever single object it is that you're looking to save. I don't actually know about save. If anyone else knows that, you can jump in and give me an answer.
I have a quick question. Is there any other stats package that has this sort of project approach as well? I haven't really found too many other stats software packages that make reproducibility like this as easy.
Yeah, I don't know. As far as I know, thanks, Peter. Sorry, Peter's posted in the chat a difference between save and save RDS. So someone's written about that on a blog. Thank you, Peter. I used to use MATLAB, and I remember it having similar functionality in terms of you could sort of work through the series of steps. One of the, I know a lot of people use Python. I don't actually know how much is possible in Python in this regard, but this is one of the reasons I love R, is that you can produce amazing graphics, you can fit statistical models, you can do data manipulation, you can run simulations. You can do so much. And so it's quite possible that this end-to-end reproducibility isn't actually as easy in many other languages.
Yeah. Okay. Are there any other questions? Okay. Thank you so much, Daniel, for joining us. I might ask you to come back and maybe talk some more about, particularly about Git. And
I'd be happy to do that. I think it deserves its own, its own workshop, and I'd be happy to help out.